So for example, the first time you ate a pizza, you might, and be like, oh, this is amazing, blah, blah, blah. And then over time, across eating pizza several times over, you now know what a pizza looks like, tastes like, smells like, and you don't have the episodic memories anymore for what that is. And the idea is that the hippocampus is thought to train the cortex, the kind of outer layer of your brain, in a way that kind of distributes that information such that if, I damage one part of your cortex, you're probably not going to, forget what a pizza is. If I take out your hippocampus, you're no longer going to be able to form episodic memories.
You're listening to The Human Upgrade with Dave Asprey. You're listening to The Human Upgrade with Dave Asprey. Today, we're going to talk memory, but not just any memory. We're going to talk psychedelics and memory. Now, if you're about to say, I'm not going to listen to this, a bunch of people talking about psychedelics, there's shamanic and journeying use for personal development or healing or spiritual things. There's also medical use for fixing things in your brain. And there's also a huge difference in dosing. Small doses of psychedelics have a very different effect. And some of this has directly to do with longevity and with cognitive performance. And if you've been listening for any of the last 10 years, you know that longevity and cognitive performance are two of the main pillars of biohacking. And biohacking itself is now a $63 billion industry, which is amazing. Starting, I guess this was 13 years ago with 100 people at a bar in San Francisco at the first biohacking conference when I started it. We're now at 3,200 people. But the entire time, how do you improve yourself? How do you improve cognitive performance? How do you heal stuff that needs healing, including trauma? And how do you live longer than you think you can, which includes having a brain that's young and flexible? That's what we're going to talk about today. And very specifically about your memory, because who wants to live a good life if you can't remember it when you're done? Our guest today is Dr. Manoj Doss. He's a scientist at the University of Texas at Austin Dell Medical School. Man, that's a mouthful.
I know.
Could they add some more?
Yeah, it's a weird thing about med schools. Sometimes want to have that extra title.
Nice. You're studying how drugs affect thinking, emotions, and the brain.
Mm-hmm.
Now, when I say drugs, is this only psychedelics, or do you look at things like metformin and rapamycin and other things?
Not those in particular, but mostly psychoactive drugs. So This could include, THC, alcohol, or other GABA-A sedatives like benzodiazepines and Ambien, as well as dissociatives, which I don't always group in with the psychedelics. So, ketamine, dextromethorphan, and then also stimulants like amphetamine and methamphetamine.
Okay. Yeah. So you're into all the good stuff.
I suppose, yeah.
A special shout out to Dr. Charan Raganath, who recommended that I talk with you.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. Charan, I worked in his lab over 10 years ago. And odd little fact, I think his grandfather sold furniture to my uncle way back in the day.
Wow.
Yeah.
The universe is so connected.
His grandfather was, I think, one of the first people to do movies in Kannada and Tamil.
Wow.
Which is like these South Indian languages. Yeah.
Amazing.
Yeah.
And he was on episode 1152 a couple months ago, and we talked about the science behind memory in general. And since you're studying psychedelics and memory, I'm like, we got to share this with all the listeners because they're really into this.
Charan was a huge influence and still is in the way I study memory. And in fact, actually, a really funny thing is when I was leaving his lab, he said, don't study drugs and memory. There's no career there. And then later on, I think this was a few years ago, he said, so I guess you're one of the people that I've given bad advice to.
Sometimes we think we know and then we find we didn't know. And it's a hallmark of someone who's done some emotional healing and has done ego work in order to be able to say, wow, I was wrong. I'm improving now.
Yeah. And I actually think, though, that there was still a piece of advice that he said there that I still think is probably true. He doesn't remember this, but he said to me, you're not going to learn anything about the mind from drugs. And I thought at the time he was being a hater, and now I think he might be more right about that than ever, but I think he might have flipped his opinion.
It's funny, by disabling or ramping up certain aspects of the mind, it feels like, as a computer hacker by training, if you're trying to get inside a black box, a system you don't understand, you turn knobs and dials and see what happens. So it feels like there is some learning we can get from psychedelics. Why do you think maybe there isn't as much?
I guess, this research, the Renaissance, so to speak, has been going on since probably the 2006 publication of Mystical Experiences, although psychedelic research was happening even before that, both in the US as well as Europe to some degree anyways. And I honestly can't say I've learned too much about the mind from these studies. Maybe it's the way that we're studying them. Whereas I can say from just basic kind of psychological paradigms, experimental psychology, or to some degree even brain imaging, I have learned certain kind of fundamental aspects of how the mind or brain works.
If you could, in 4 sentences, tell me how the mind works, what would you say?
I don't think I could do that. I think that some people would, the big kind of overarching model that some people, especially in the psychedelic world, are going off of is the predictive processing framework. I don't totally buy it. But yeah, it's hard for me to say. I think there is some type of hierarchical way in which the mind works and things get more abstracted, and we probably only have access to some of that. But that's, not being very specific at all.
If you're saying predictive processing, what? There's a guy named Jeff Hawkins, who was the guy who invented the first handwriting recognition for the first personal digital assistant, what would be the great grandfather of the iPhone. This was called the Trio back in the day. And he wrote a major book outlining how the brain predicts the future microseconds from now.
Jeff Hawkins.
Yep.
I think, wait a minute, I might have got his book at one point, but I never read it.
It was one of those books that really changed the way I think about it, because whether it's how things actually work, the reality is that you notice things that aren't as they should be. Mm-hmm. And he goes in great detail into brain structures and things like that. And it's something that some of my more advanced students at 40 years is in my neuroscience facility or neuroscience experience, I suggest they read it because it's useful for thinking about this. If my brain is only noticing things, what is it not noticing? And that's why, for instance, skeptics die, I think, 6 years earlier than non-skeptics.
Oh, that sucks for me.
Well, there's curious people. They're saying, I don't know. And skeptics are the ones who say, that can't be, therefore it isn't.
Yeah. I think I'm always open to new possibilities, but yeah, I think I can certainly sometimes be a little skeptical, especially among psychedelic scientists.
Yeah, there could be some people who maybe sample a little too much. Speaking of that, if I accidentally spilled some ayahuasca in your danger coffee before we started, would that be a better interview?
No, I probably would be unable to speak. I think a lot of people forget sometimes that with psychedelics that, it kind of, for some people anyways, for a lot of people, at least at different moments in time, it can kind of cut off your ability to speak very easily or very fluidly. We were doing this task at Hopkins, kind of this free association task where, you're primed with a stimulus and then you're just supposed to chain off words. And, the idea is that, you get very free associative, whatever. And people were struggling. I only, watched like a handful of participants do it, and maybe the data will look different. But people were definitely struggling. We would tell people, okay, if you can't come up with a word, just say the word you said previously. And then so after finally somebody gets a word, they're like, ketchup. And then they're like, ketchup.
I'm reminded, I recently was down at Eterna, where I got some gene therapy for longevity. And they also did a procedure where they were injecting a kind of Japanese stem cell into my reproductive system. And so they gave me ketamine as an anesthetic. And I said, well, don't give me enough to really knock me out. It's already numb with lidocaine. I'm just going to do a video for you. And so I'm doing the video. And afterwards, I'm like, and finally they just like shoved probably a little propofol, even though I didn't want it, just to make me shut up so they could finish the procedure.
Did you put the video online ever?
No, I sound like a total moron, right? So at the time I didn't think I did, but that can happen, right?
That sounds like it would be a fun video though. There's I probably shouldn't say who this is, but there was a group that I knew that they were piloting one of their studies, and I think they got approval to do this. So a few of the researchers were testing out doses One of the researchers seemed to really like it. Another person was like, this is kind of weird. And then another person, slightly on the older side, who'd probably never tried ketamine, ends up getting it. And then in the video, this person goes, oh, it feels like I'm, moving away to the back of the room. And then all of a sudden it's like, oh God. And then the camera shuts off. And then I heard that they're like, take it out, stop.
Here's something for you if you dread allergy season. It might make you forget it's even happening. It's Armra colostrum. Colostrum is one of nature's powerful bioactive foods, and it's the first nutrition that everyone receives when they're born so they can thrive for their entire life. Armra colostrum has over 400 bioactive ingredients that strengthen your body's barriers and create cellular health. There are thousands of research-backed benefits. And when it comes to allergy season, you want to get some Armra colostrum. Colostrum strengthens your respiratory barriers to change how your body interacts with allergens. When you strengthen your body's barriers in your nose, your sinuses, your lungs, you can manage how your body responds to those environmental allergens. So if you want natural support during allergy season and beyond, Armra colostrum is your friend. Go to tryarmra.com/Dave and get 15% off your first order. That's tryarmra.com/Dave. Let's talk about memory specifically, because you've studied this so extensively, which is exciting. Walk me through the phases of memory. Like what happens when I want to remember our conversation?
Yeah. So especially when you're talking about with, manipulating memory with drugs, you always have to consider 3 phases. A fourth one that maybe we'll touch on later. But that will be encoding, consolidation, and retrieval. So encoding is when you're forming your memories, like when you're studying, for example. Consolidation is when you're, those memories are stabilizing. In some ways, people will refer to this as being like offline. So, there's still things happening at the synaptic level, from 1 hour ago that will determine whether or not I can remember this experience or remember that experience from an hour ago. And then lastly, there's retrieval. So your ability to access your memories, remembering essentially. And so, for example, in the lab, what we can do is we can give people, show people a bunch of stimuli, and they can be on the drug during that time period, in which case it'll affect the encoding or the formation of those memories. We can give a drug immediately afterwards, after we show them a bunch of, let's say, pictures, and that can retroactively impact those memories in a certain way. There's a really cool effect with alcohol. And then you can also just give people, show people a bunch of stimuli, and then let's say a day later, so that way you wait for those memories to stabilize, you can now give them the drug and see how it impacts the way they access those memories. And what you can end up showing is, especially with different drugs, is that they don't affect all those stages of memory the same. I think, as I was just kind of alluding to with alcohol, everybody knows if you study drunk, you're not going to remember anything the next day for your test.
Right.
However, if you study and then get drunk immediately afterwards, and, in the studies in the lab, we're talking, 4 shots in 10 minutes.
Oh, that's so bad for you. You'd be hungover the next day.
Right. And so assuming you can perform on, your test with a hangover, you might actually retain more than had you not drank at all. Wow. And so it's a very, it's known as retrograde facilitation. It's a very paradoxical effect because, you study drunk, you're not going to remember anything the next day for your test. You study, get drunk immediately afterwards, and it'll enhance your memory. And this hasn't been quite tested in like a very, ecologically valid situation. It's not like they've gotten a bunch of students drunk and done this. But for example, at least showing people words, images, sentences, emotional words or images, and then using pretty much any GABA-A positive allosteric modulators, so alcohol, benzodiazepines, and Ambien.
Or kava.
Kava could work too. Exactly. I don't know.
Shout out to my friends at True Kava.
Yeah, I've actually wondered that myself. So kava, it turns out at least with the propofol, it might actually impair your memory, but
propofol screws up your mitochondria, which are the basis of energy for memory. So
yeah, it's also a GABA-A agonist. It might even have some GABA-B effects, and so there's other things, and it doesn't work with GABA-E agonists anyway. With GHB, anyways, that's one. Someone tested that one, but it does work with the GABA-A positive allosteric modulators. And people have had different delays between study and test. It's been shown by numerous groups around the world.
Have you ever studied or looked at aniracetam?
No, but you're talking about one of the neurotropics, like the...
Yeah. So aniracetam, it's a pharmaceutical. It's in the racetam family, and these have been around since the 50s. Actually, Sandoz Pharmaceuticals, who also was the manufacturer of pharmaceutical LSD for the studies that Stan Groff did. Stan was on the show years ago. He's the father of transpersonal psychology and invented holotropic breath work for listeners. Anyhow, you look at aniracetam, it's the only racetam that improves memory I/O in studies. And I've been on it for 22 years, almost every day. And I notice a huge difference on aniracetam. I just remember all of these things and I can recall them. Like what I just did there with Stan Groff, it's all right there. And if I don't take it for a couple of days, I notice there's a slight delay in word recall. Like it's a very noticeable effect. It's one of those things that no one's going to make money off aniracetam because it's off patent for God knows how long. But it's one that I wish there was more research on. So I'll give you a bottle.
Yeah, you think it's better than what's the one that a lot of people the one starts with a P?
Yeah, piracetam is kind of the one everyone studied the most. And there's lots of analogs. So phenylpiracetam is more energetic than piracetam. And there's oxiracetam and some of the others. I've tried all of them. And the one that I stand by for memory is aniracetam. It's also the only racetam that is stress or anxiety reducing as well. So it's also the only one that I know of that's fat soluble. So I take that stuff in the morning and I really notice a difference. Piracetam, especially for young people, it helps as well, but it depletes acetylcholine, which is an important neurotransmitter. So you have to take a choline donor when you take it. So for people listening, this is my favorite memory drug, but who knows, maybe we're going to learn some new ones in this interview.
Yeah. So, I mean, the thing with memory in general, a lot of times is that you can enhance one thing at the expense of something else. So, there's kind of like a general filtering mechanism. There's, kind of a limit to what you can remember. Some people think, for example, like, emotion, it enhances your memory. Well, it enhances certain elements. There's what's known as, for example, the weapon focus effect, where you can, for example, if somebody's pointing a gun at you, you might remember the gun and what's like around it, and it's the immediate surrounding, but then everything in the context behind it, you might forget now. And so, I would always be curious as to, well, is there ever what's the downside? That's what I'm always concerned with when, enhancing anything.
It's funny. Everything we do has an upside and downside, including golf, including lotion. I'm like everything in your body. And we don't really study the downside of lots of things. For instance, fragrances have a really serious downside on your hormone system, but people use them all the time without even knowing.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I think this is true, sports, right? They're obviously generally pretty good for you, training and all that. But then, how many downsides to even yoga, your joints can potentially get a little messed up.
Sure.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. It's funny. It's called danger coffee we're drinking because who knows what you might do, but all the things worth doing have some element of danger, even if it's just eating breakfast, right? There's always something, but the things like asking the girl out, getting a degree, starting a company, whatever is the thing that seems daunting, that's what you want to have the power to do. And oftentimes unlocking trauma is a part of that because the internal resistance is there. And psychedelics can help with that, but there's many ways that are non-psychedelic, like neurofeedback, like breath work, like EMDR. And there's this long list that people know from the show. And when we're looking at being able to remember things better, this is really important for executives, for students. And frankly, as you age, a lot of people start losing their memory, but they don't know it. I'm not going to name any certain politician, for instance, when we talk about that. But if you realize there are ways you can protect or enhance it, and they may include psychedelics, they may not, this is just precious knowledge. There's two kinds of memory that I want to know how to enhance, and one I suck at and one I'm world-class at. There's episodic memory and semantic memory. What's the difference?
Yeah, so episodic memory is more of, your event memory for where and when something happened. That, yesterday I went to go pick up my partner at the airport, at 8:00. Whereas semantic memory is more of this kind of general knowledge, you might call it like crystallized knowledge or something along those lines. So knowing that George Washington is the first president of the country, you have the semantic memory for that. You no longer have the episodic memory for where and when you learn that information. Or even like knowing what a pizza is, right? I know what a pizza looks like, tastes like, smells like, and yet I can't remember the first time I had a pizza. And so a lot of times the way things kind of are thought to work in the brain, there's a very simplistic way of describing this. And Churin might get a little mad at me for describing this in a way that people described it 30 years ago, but I'm just, for the sake of, simplicity, I'm going to say it. But so one idea is essentially that your hippocampus is, it binds a bunch of disparate elements together into these episodes. So, for example, my partner doesn't have anything to do with an airport, not necessarily anyways, but together, I can put this into a single episode. And then over time, you can kind of extract the statistical regularities across those episodes. So, for example, the first time you eat a pizza, you might, be like, oh, this is amazing, blah, blah, blah. And then over time, across eating pizza several times over, you now know what a pizza looks like, tastes like, smells like, and you don't have like the episodic memories anymore for what that is. And the idea is that the hippocampus is thought to train the cortex, the kind of outer layer of your brain, in a way that kind of distributes that information such that if, I damage one part of your cortex, you're probably not going to, forget what a pizza is. If I take out your hippocampus, you're no longer going to be able to form episodic memoes. And so it's a very kind of interesting distributed system. And over time, Alzheimer's is a great example where they get so much damage, first to the hippocampus and they can't form, episodic memories. But even over time, there starts to be damage to the cortex, and then they can, forget their mother's face or these very kind of obvious crystallized memories.
One of the hallmarks of aging is hippocampal shrinkage. So, of course, I measure my hippocampus because why not? And I'm 87th percentile, which means whatever biohacking longevity stuff I've done over the last 20 years seems to be working. But there are ways of regenerating hippocampus. How would you go about doing that?
So, yeah, it's one of two regions that can have neurogenesis, the other being olfactory cortex. So, an area that represents smell. But yeah, your hippocampus is one of those regions. But there's something to be said about more is not always better. It's kind of like, for example, since, when you were 5 years old, you probably had the most connections your brain has ever had. And then you prune those connections over time. One idea is that it makes things more efficient. You get kind of less bizarre associations that are probably not going to, do anything for you for the sake of your survival or whatever. And so, I don't always, it does seem to be the case that certain disorders, PTSD, depression, they're associated with smaller hippocampi. But like, for example, there was a really famous study where they had taxi drivers, or they had people who were becoming taxi drivers in London. There's what's known as, I forgot what it's called. It's like The Book or something. Yeah. And they have to learn, London really well. And what they showed was from before to after learning, going through that procedure, that their posterior hippocampus became larger. I think that the interior hippocampus became smaller though. And so, and again, I don't know how well that replicates. I think the actual posterior hippocampus, in fact, probably does replicate. I'm not sure about the interior one. But, there's always kind of compensation, and more is not always better. I mean, you can, look at, for example, people, I don't know if the hippocampi are actually bigger, but there are people who are like super rememberers, and, they can remember like which episode on what day, Joey from Friends did whatever. And I say that because I think that's the example someone used. But they tend to sometimes have, I think, kind of problems, like affective problems. And so, I'm not always convinced that, having more, although I think you're right that it does get smaller, and that probably is somewhat of a sign of, aging and memory getting worse. So I don't know, to make things better though, to make things more, let's say if you did just want to make it larger, I think exercise seems to be one. There's also it's unclear if hippocampal neurogenesis even happens in adult humans. There's some like people out there who are still, that they're saying that this is, it might not happen as much as we think it does, or it might not even happen at all. So I think it's still kind of controversial and then those new neurons also haven't like integrated necessarily into circuits either that could be useful. They might be more useful for things that are less important. So, if I were going to tell you anything about how to make your memory better, I think exercise is probably the best one.
What if advanced physics discovered an energy that underlies reality that's very hard to detect? Well, they have. It's called quantum energy, and you can get a PhD in it. It's real, but it's invisible. When you can use it right, it enhances your vitality, reduces stress, and since stress accelerates aging, a lot of us are working on that problem. One of my favorite companies is Lila Quantum because they have dozens of studies, double-blind, placebo-controlled, showing that when you use their technology to change your quantum energy state, your body measurably handles stress better. EMFs are a significant stressor. It damages cells and causes oxidative stress. What if you could undo that by going at a level below the EMFs, which is the quantum level? Well, that research includes 59 studies and a recent third-party study showing between a 20 and 29% increase in ATP production, which is the energy currency of your mitochondria. Those studies show significant improvements in blood quality and heart rate variability, which is a key marker for your resilience from all causes. Learn more at lilaq.com/Dave and save 10%. We know that exercise increases blood flow in the brain. Mm-hmm. I'm on the board of Amen Clinics, and Daniel Amen was just on stage at the Biohacking conference, and is a dear friend whose work really changed my life. Looking at like 500,000 brain scans, you can measure blood flow, and we know that exercise does that. But maybe more importantly, exercise raises a compound called BDNF. Mm-hmm. Can you talk about that and what it does?
Yeah, so brain-derived neurotrophic factor. So first of all, a neurobio person would definitely be the person more to ask about this, but it has become especially talked about a lot with amongst like psychedelic researchers. And so it's at least one component involved in different forms of neural plasticity. So that includes neurogenesis. It also includes, for example, forming new dendrites, so connections, the branches between neurons, or at least one of the types of branches between neurons. And so, some evidence suggests, that psychedelics can, upregulate BDNF, as well as now there was a study that just came out that, suggested that psychedelics actually bind the same receptor, TrkB, as BDNF. Although I also saw some people, have now been like, wait a minute, we tested 40,000 compounds and none of them bind to TrkB. Like, we don't believe that psychedelics bind to it either. And so it's still, there's still research to be done, but one idea is that might be responsible for how psychedelics are enhancing at least certain types of plasticity. So specifically that structural plasticity, the dendrites, essentially growth of dendrites, or what are known as spines, these little buttons on the dendrites. But the neurogenesis stuff, for example, with psychedelics is not as clear as some people, including myself, have made it out to be. I've cited papers, and then later on I'm like, actually there's a lot of papers that don't find the effect of neurogenesis.
Interesting.
Yeah.
If that's why exercise works, one of my major books, this was the one that was on the New York Times Science bestseller list, which as an author was, wow, that's the list that's hard to get on versus the advice list. And it was sandwiched between Homo Deus and Sapiens. And the book was called Headstrong. And I'm like, 2 things you can do if you want to have a better brain, which includes memory. It's have enough mitochondrial activity in the brain and have enough BDNF that you have the ability to at least resculpt it. And there are some things that we know work: fasting, exercise, interesting studies of lion's mane around BDNF. And then more recently, I invested in Paul Stamets's company. He has something called the Stamets Stack. And Paul's been on the show. He's a friend, and he's like the mushroom guy, the fungus guy.
Yeah, I saw him at, he gave a talk right before mine at the Texas Eclipse Festival. Yeah.
Perfect. Oh, wait, I was at a different Eclipse Festival here. Yeah, he's just an amazing human. And what he found was mixing psilocybin, lion's mane, and niacin to increase blood flow in the brain was causing whole brain neurogenesis. This is a pharmaceutical company that he started in order to use this for things like traumatic brain injury or for things like aging, like Alzheimer's. And so it looks like there's some evidence that we can do this. And that wasn't just hippocampus, that was whole brain. Thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, I would have to see the data, and one of my neurobio friends would have to approve of it. I think, people have talked about other regions in the brain having neurogenesis. And, every time, there's something that comes out, there's always somebody who's like, I don't think that's quite the case. And like I said, even with, the hippocampus, there's people out there who are saying, at least in adult humans, I'm not sure if how much neurogenesis is actually happening there. The other thing you have to always consider is how those neurons are wiring up. They're not going to wire the same way they did previously. And, manipulating that in a way that can be, adaptive is probably not easy. If you have a brain that's overly linked up, it can potentially lead to, interference in information processing. Or, I don't know, perhaps, I don't want to say seizures, but, there can be things that can happen when there's too much of something going on.
Especially without any organization. Right. That's why I use neurofeedback with substances, even just regular BDNF promoters, so that at least the neurons know where to go. So they're generated and called into action. And the effects have been, over the last 11 years, pretty potent.
This actually, makes me wonder. So, for example, with psychedelic therapy, we just leave people on a couch with eye shades on while they have a massive dose and they listen to white people music. And I always wonder, should we be doing something with them, right? Should we be perhaps, driving certain ideas? Like, this sounds almost like brainwashing or something. I don't mean it like that. But I don't know, telling somebody they're a good person or something, after 10 years of thinking that you're a terrible human being, you now have formed a semantic memory for that, George Washington is the first president of the country. I'm a terrible human being.
What if they really are?
Yeah. I'm
just kidding.
I think that, I don't know, good and bad is a weird thing, right? I don't know if there's always good and bad people.
I totally, that was a joke. What we did is we launched our new product called Psychedelic Assisted Neurofeedback, where you're on a substance at 40 years of Zen, and we're using ketamine for very specific reasons, low dose ketamine, not going on a journey. And we're showing your brain what it's doing, which is different than putting something into the brain. And then we take you through a structured meditation process. Well, you're more synaptically plastic. And the idea here is that even if you go into a deeper journey, which you do on one of the days, your brain is getting feedback on what it's doing during the journey. So you kind of have a better automatic or subconscious sense of where you're going. And the results so far have been people are able to do more of the deep forgiveness work. This is the core of the program when they're doing it with that. And we measure that by brainwaves. We know what that looks like on a brainwave when someone has a transformative experience. And so we can guide them into that more deeply.
But how do you know what those brainwaves are reflecting? This is what's known as a reverse inference problem.
After you have 1,500 people go through a program, when you see this specific pattern and large numbers of people report this kind of experience, like I could tell you what deep, authentic forgiveness really looks like in a brain because we have enough data on that.
So, yeah, it's interesting. So right now, neuroimaging, right? So if you're talking about EEG, that's been around for, over 100 years or about 100 years.
Yeah.
And then fMRI has been around now for 30 years. And yet neither of these tools are used in psychiatry. EEG is used in some neurology. It's used in, sleep disorders and epilepsy, but it's not used, in depression or anxiety.
Psychiatrists who use it.
And yet I don't know any. And
let's talk Daniel Amen. He's a psychiatrist, and he's got 500,000 SPECT scans, which is a kissing cousin to fMRI.
Yeah, and fMRI is better, I'll say.
Well, but except that one study that showed it was all junk.
Well, there's a lot of studies that have been showing. It's funny how fMRI researchers are the biggest haters of fMRI, myself included. And so I think that they're interesting tools for research, but they haven't really cracked anything yet that's really promising for diagnosis or prognosis or anything. And yeah, we have tens of thousands of scans and have, some of the best people looking at, using machine learning to try to pick things out. And yet it hasn't been super useful yet. And so this is why, wondering, it's like, okay, well, sometimes you can see certain brain waves, for example, or let's just say, brain activity, let's say in the amygdala. The amygdala, everybody thinks, oh, it's emotion center, fear center. You can see the amygdala activity when people are probably scared. You can see it when they're looking at somebody scared. You can also see it when people look at a happy face or if they're looking at something salient versus non-salient.
During sex, it's very active.
I'm sure, but if you but you can also see it if you compare, let's say, like a checkerboard versus a gray screen. My guess is the amygdala activity is going to be up for the checkerboard. Salience, so it's like you can't, this is the idea of reverse inference is we are unable to infer what's going on in the mind based on brain activity. What we can do is the other way around, where you can look at certain types of behavior and know that, the associated brain activity with it. But usually, a different brain areas, they respond for multiple different stimuli. And so it gets a little difficult. Yeah.
Didn't some researchers recently look at high-resolution EEG brain scan and be able to infer what a person was looking at just on their brainwaves?
Yeah, and you can probably even do that, I think. Yeah, you can do that from MRI as well, especially if the images are quite distinct from each other, like an object versus a scene.
This was a scene of like a road with cars and a tree or something. And I would say that what the AI model looking at brainwaves predicted was 90% the same.
I mean, you definitely do some pretty cool reconstructions that, but if you look at, for example, even like actual brain activity, if you get patients with, electrodes in their heads, usually it's because of something like epilepsy. And so they're about to go for a surgery. It's like sometimes the reconstructions of their brain activity for what they're saying, it's like, it's like not like perfect, So, I mean, I think it's getting better, but yet, I mean, as I said, it's not like a tool that we typically use. We don't scan somebody's brain and say, okay, this is the medication you should go on, or you have this flavor of depression or anxiety or whatever. It would be really useful, right? Because then, for example, we wouldn't accidentally give somebody with bipolar disorder when they're depressed the wrong medication. But yet we don't do that because I don't think it hasn't, it's not that useful yet. Yeah.
It's at very early days. I'm with you. I want to go back to episodic memory versus semantic memory. And guys, episodic is, I remember something happened on a certain day, and semantic is, I know how stuff fits together. So I mentioned earlier, I'm really good at semantic memory, like world class. I just got all that stuff in there. Episodic memory, I don't know what day of the week it is. I don't know what I did yesterday or last week. I literally look at my phone, and to me, anything that happened more than 2 weeks ago could be 6 weeks or 6 months or 2 years ago, and it's all the same. What's going on in there?
That's interesting. Yeah. So, it's interesting. So semantic memory, as I mentioned, it's kind of this, it usually takes a longer period of time before it gets into semantic memory, but sure, after a year, that probably, if you have something from a year ago, it might be semanticized, so to speak. And so, I don't know if my episodic memory is great either, but at least the things that I know, I can tend to get in there. Like, so for example, if you give me a new fact about psychedelics, I'll probably be able to retain it. It's interesting. Like, I think that with certain specialty, with the way of, if you have a schema, for example, if you have a way of kind of encoding this information, there might be an easier transfer to, let's say, semantic memory. But a lot of times, at least when you initially form a memory, like, let's say, a lot of times for when people are studying, for a test, for example, what they'll do is they'll sometimes try to remember the page, the textbook that they saw it. And you can say that even though it's almost like a semantic memory that they're trying to form, and yet they're using episodic memory to recover it, right? Because it's not very quick that we can necessarily transfer this information. But I think a lot of it probably has to do with just specialized knowledge, that the things that get transferred the easiest are going to be what we already have schemas kind of built in for. The way that we encode information a lot of times has to do with what's already there. And so what ends up getting into semantic memory particularly might end up being what it's most related to in the first place. So I don't know. Yeah, you study a lot of biohacking, and I'm sure it's easy for you to then you read a new piece about biohacking and then it gets into there, But if you were like studying like, I don't know, like Mandarin or something, don't tell me you know Mandarin. But let's say you don't know Mandarin.
Not even a little bit.
Or maybe it'll get in there easy. In my case, it wouldn't. But, I think that, for example, like I was trying to learn a little French during the pandemic. Luckily, it's close enough to Spanish and Portuguese. So even if you took out my hippocampus, so one thing that's worth mentioning is it's not always clear what's a semantic memory and episodic memory, except these very clear examples of, okay, George Washington, first president of the country. You took out my hippocampus, I would still probably know George Washington as the first president of the country. And that's kind of the way at least I would define it. I don't know if every memory researcher would agree with that. So that's a semantic memory. And, it's unclear exactly like what is an episodic versus semantic memory sometime. But at least in the case of something like, if you were to take out my hippocampus, I'm pretty sure I would still know a little bit of French, and that might give you an idea of like what gets into semantic memory and what doesn't. And actually, one of the things I'm proposing with psychedelics is that it might speed things up to get into semantic memory.
Interesting. But it looks like some psychedelics can reduce episodic memory.
I think that they generally do. And so I think they essentially bypass the hippocampus in some ways. So, if there's any reliable effect on memory, is that encoding specifically, not consolidation or retrieval, although there might be some interesting effects there as well. But when it comes to the formation or encoding of memories, if there's any reliable effect with psychedelics or any drug, it's that hippocampal dependent memory gets worse. But something that at least we found with psilocybin, MDMA, and I just had a paper published this past week with psilocybin and 2CB, is that it looks like this, kind of, you could think of almost like a short-term semantic memory that hasn't quite become a permanent fixture in your cortex just yet. That this form of memory known as familiarity does seem to kind of get enhanced. And, essentially familiarity over time can become a semantic memory. It has this sense of knowing. So familiarity can be thought of as, one day I might see you somewhere out, in Austin, and I might say, you look really familiar, but I can't remember where I met you, when I met you, what your name is. I just know I've met you. That's familiarity in the absence of, this typical episodic memory recollection. And so over time, after several repetitions, which enhance familiarity, that's probably what produces something like a semantic, permanent, kind of crystallized semantic memory. And so I think that, by enhancing familiarity, psychedelics might help drive information into the cortex. People sometimes lead these experiences having the sense of knowing, even though they can't remember all the steps and recollections, the episodic memories that lead to a sense of knowing. Sometimes it's some bizarre things like, oh, I understand the universe. And it's like, all right, how do you know you understand the universe? It's like, I wouldn't be able to tell you. I just know I do, And then other times it might be, more useful, like, oh yeah, I'm not a bad person, right? And they don't know everything. They can't recollect everything that took them to that point. But knowing that they're not a bad person is probably something that could be useful.
I've worked with a good number of people, whether you want to call them psychics or readers or whatever, and they somehow seem to have developed this, I'm just going to call it knowingness, right? You can give them a name and you think of someone and they tell you all these facts about the person. And you're like, how could you possibly know this? And you ask them, they say, well, it's just right there. I just know it. Are they crazy?
I'm not a medical professional, so I shouldn't make that diagnosis. But yeah, I wouldn't be the first person to believe them. I believe they believe themselves, but I wouldn't necessarily be one. And I think that that's a type of, so this like driving of noeticism, I think is something that psychedelics can do. And as I said, I think it can be potentially bizarre at times, but it could also be adaptive. For example, something that's, as we, kind of discuss is less objective, like you being a good or bad person or thinking that the world is dangerous or not, The truth is it's both. It's dangerous, sometimes it's not. And, thinking that it's always dangerous is probably not useful, or knowing that it's always dangerous is not useful. But I do wonder, and it's something that, we've wanted to test. If somebody gave me $1 million, one of the first things I would do would be looking at different types of learning under psychedelics and seeing whether or not there's certain things we can enhance that is objective, like let's say language learning. You can think of languages. I used that example earlier. They might initially start episodic. You might think, oh, how do I conjugate this verb? And they become rather automatic and, crystallized. You ask a person, whose first language is something that, you don't speak, why is it this way? And they'll be like, I don't know, it just is, they just know that it is. And so I think that it would be very interesting to, for example, look at psychedelics and whether it's language learning or certain types of kind of automated crystallized learning to see if they might speed up that process.
And this would obviously be dose dependent, right? And a lot of these things will cause auditory distortions, which aren't going to be helpful with French, which to me sounds like auditory distortion anyway. No offense, my kids speak fluent French. And when I try to hear it, I know my auditory processing is weird. And French and Swedish, both to me, I just don't hear them right.
French is definitely the weirdest one out of the Romance languages. Sorry, French people.
Yeah, no shade there. I've tried and it doesn't stick, but Spanish is fine for my brain. And so if I could take a psychedelic that let me learn French, that's fantastic. I also don't know that I'd put the effort into that because I'd probably rather learn some more neuroscience than French.
Yeah. Well, so, it's interesting. You said it distorts, audition. And I mean, it obviously does, and probably in ways that aren't as true to reality. But if you think about, the way like sounds, phonetics and things work in the first place, they are, we interpret things like I'm trying to think of an example. I did not do very well on my auditory neuroscience class. But like, for example, I think like B's and P's are sort of on a spectrum, or M's and N's, I think, are on a spectrum. And your M might be more like my N, for example.
Right.
And we end up very quickly picking up on, which phoneme you're trying to say, And so that might, be one of the sources of auditory distortions under psychedelics. No one's studied this properly.
Right.
And in which case, that could actually probably help you with certain languages, understanding them.
So you're saying LSD could help me understand French?
I don't know, but I would love to test that.
And again, no shade on French speakers. It's just a challenge, man. Like, I do not know how people hear that language, but I also recognize that we all have our unique auditory processing stuff, and it's weird.
I have always thought, I was like, yeah, if an alien came to Earth, let's say they stop in Spain and they're like, okay, this is how, humans speak. And they, pop over to Portugal and they're like, okay, they go to Italy. Then they get to French and they're like, that's not how you guys actually sound, right?
So they're all the same
with me.
Yeah, yeah. And then you get into some of those other languages that are like Mandarin. That all the little sounds. Westerners just don't have brains to hear that, and that has to do a lot with the sounds you hear when you're very young.
Right. And so there's this idea, right, that psychedelics, people think that it opens up this critical period, and that people report feeling very childlike under it. It'd be very interesting to see if those types of things. So you can do this with babies, right? Two sounds that sound the exact same to us, something in a tonal language and then without the tonal bit as much, it would sound the same to us. But then, as you said, somebody with, who speaks Mandarin would be like, oh yeah, no, those are very distinct things. And babies can, they'll do, I think they'll end up like fixating more. I'm forgetting what the word is, but essentially they'll fixate more if there's something novel, but then they'll, kind of habituate if it's not novel. So if you have two different sounds, they'll be like, huh? Versus if you just repeat the sound a couple times. And so it'd be interesting, for example, I don't know if a human would necessarily notice, an adult human, sorry, babies are humans as well. But
I've heard.
I don't know if an adult human would necessarily, notice the difference, but this would be a useful place for like brain evoked potentials, and just seeing, do they get treated somewhat differently? So yeah, I think that would be, super interesting. Yeah.
And in the context of understanding, guys, what is an evoked potential? It's when you hear or you see something, how quickly does your brain get the signal that you heard that? And funny enough, young people have a faster speed, and as you age, you get to about 350 milliseconds or so. So you have a delay on reality. But people who meditate or take care of their brains can maintain the evoked potential of a young person. Like, I have the same response time as an 18-year-old last time I measured my evoked potential. So it's
play video games. I have some friends that are big gamers. Chad James and Sam Mitchell, and these guys I actually used to skate with way back in the day, and now they're like they're gamers. But yeah, when I was asking Sam, I was like, well, what makes I was like, who are the best gamers? He's like, oh, it's always people under 30. It's all about reaction times. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And it seems like that can be trained for sure. I also wonder, we're talking about, this will sound dark, so you got to stick with me. We're talking about people in that kind of neuroplastic state when they're coming off of psychedelics. And you can train people with positive reinforcement, but we all know that negative reinforcement is better. So if you took someone and gave them like a mild electric shock every time they didn't hear sounds, they'd probably learn the difference between those sounds much more quickly than if they had a positive reinforcement.
Is that so? I mean, this is one of those things that I don't know as well as I should have, and it's also a little bit on the side of conditioning, another memory system. Mm-hmm. So conditioning, for example, is the kind of automatic response to something. So you hear a sound associated with a shock, and then you might not even remember that you ever did this experiment, but you hear that sound again, you're like, something doesn't feel right. A really, I think, famous case is there was this guy who didn't have a hippocampus, or he had some kind of damage to it, couldn't form episodic memories. You would never be able to do this, by the way, now, but this was done, 100 years ago or something. Not the most ethical. And so the doctor's meeting him, and he puts a tack in his hand and essentially pokes the person's hand. The person goes, ow, And then, of course, the next day he meets the doctor again. It's like, oh, hey, the doctor reaches his hand out and goes, hey, what's up? Like, I'm whatever, doctor, whatever. And the person is like, I'm not going to shake your hand. It's like, why not? It's like, it's dirty. Like they made up some answer, but there was like a conditioned response to that doctor. So, when it comes to things like, there's some evidence, I thought, that, positive reinforcement works better than punishment in terms of like training. And so I don't know. I think that you can learn very quickly certain things. For example, an animal, if you shock them in an environment, they're going to be afraid, or due to a sound or something, they're going to know that sound, they're going to be forever afraid of that sound in one trial,
Yeah. And I'm not proposing we do this to humans or animals. I would. A mild electric shock that doesn't cause serious pain, like a rubber band snapping you on the wrist kind of a thing. And the only time it goes off is when you don't hear the right sound. So then you don't, your body's going to say one sound is better than another. It's not hearing them both that is the risk.
Yeah. So I think it probably also depends. So it depends on the memory system, I think. So for example, I think, if you're norepinephrine, for example, it might be something that's more related to especially negative emotional events. And there's been some evidence that, norepinephrine can keep memories kind of hippocampal dependent. This might even, this has been proposed even to potentially underlie PTSD. So, they have this traumatic event and it remains hippocampal dependent. It never like integrates into the cortex where it loses details, and people might still know that they fought in the war, but they lost a lot of those specific details that are traumatic. And instead it remains in this kind of episodic state.
Is that because of high norepinephrine or low norepinephrine?
That's high norepinephrine. Okay. And some people have, shown this with yohimbine. Are you familiar with that one?
I took some this morning. Yeah.
Oh, yeah. Oh, wow. Yeah. I took it one time when I went skating, and, so I do like rollerblading with tricks and flips and grinds. I'm not doing as much of the flips anymore. But, it's one of these things where it gets your kind of heart rate up. You get a little scared, even now it's like I'm doing something that I've done before, and, you know that you can get hurt.
Yeah.
And I feel like they just amplified my fear, and my heart was just, maybe I took too much of it, but I never took it again. But yeah, they did a study with yohimbine, and they showed that, 30 days later, the memory was like just as much, if not more, dependent on the hippocampus that were formed memories under yohimbine. But then there's what's been proposed is like dopamine, and I don't want to say dopamine's the pleasure molecule, and
it kind of is.
Yeah, I don't know if I would totally buy that. You take L-Dopa and you don't feel pleasure usually. You take L-Dopa for a long period of time, you might become a sex addict or a gambling addict.
Oh, you can become dopamine desensitized, of course.
Well, I was saying actually, if you take it over a period of time, so if you take L-Dopa for like one time, you don't really get pleasure from it. You might get nausea. It's kind of,
If you took it and you had sex, it would be better sex.
I wonder. I don't know. I don't know if they've done that study, but I knew that, certainly amphetamine, people, take, stimulants, and, they have, they have some, certain interesting experiences. But at least L-Dopa alone, I've just heard, that I didn't actually know this until I had a psychiatry friend that was telling me that, over time, sometimes people will take L-Dopa and then they can develop things like a gambling addiction or sex addiction or whatever, but it certainly doesn't happen overnight. And I don't know if a single dose. I took L-Dopa once for a study, and I was, I didn't really get anything out of it, but I had a friend who got a lot of nausea from it.
Interesting.
But yeah, it's like, but dopamine in any case, it is involved in reward. It can also be involved in negative kind of learning as well.
Yeah.
But one idea with dopamine is that it does help kind of drive things into the cortex. It helps consolidate these memories, or, make them more kind of semanticized. And so I do wonder, depending on the type of learning you're doing, should we really be rewarding people during certain types of learning to kind of drive that learning into the cortex, make it a more permanent kind of semantic memory?
It's so fascinating.
Yeah.
All right. Is cannabis good for memory?
I think the short answer is no. Whether you're talking about the encoding of memories, it certainly doesn't seem to help things get in. Whether you're talking about I don't know if it does much to the consolidation. So if you study and then smoke weed afterwards, there was one study that did that. And although alcohol enhanced your memory, cannabis didn't really do anything. One thing that we found was that if you try to retrieve memories on THC, it'll actually distort your memory. It'll make you just come up with a bunch of garbage. And so, for example, what we did was we showed people a bunch of like labels that were followed by pictures, and there was like negative, neutral, and positive images. So, for example, you have a guy sitting on his porch, and then maybe you get a picture of a guy sitting on his porch. You get, happy baby, and, you maybe get a picture of a happy baby. You get, dying baby in the ICU. I say that because that's a real stimulus. And you don't get a picture of a dying baby in the ICU, for example. And then later on, 2 days later, we give you THC, and then we test your memory by showing you all those labels again and asking you, did you see this as a picture? And we could get people to say they saw pictures of a dying baby in the ICU when they never actually did. And they would say it with like, we gave them like a 5-point confidence scale. They would say it with high confidence. And so, in that sense, we said that, well, it seems like it can distort your memory to the point where potentially it could create a false memory. I don't think most cannabis users are, having these massively distorted memories, but the point is it's not impossible for that to happen, especially maybe if you were under certain suggestible conditions. And then I think the long-term effects of cannabis, I think there's some, evidence that, if you're a daily user, probably all day, every day user, maybe even just once a day user, that it's not great. A lot of your cognitive faculties do get a little worse, including episodic memory. But I think to some degree they can recover if you, quit for a month or so. I don't know how permanent that is, but I think it all depends on how much you're doing it. And, like you said, there's positives and negatives to all these things. And I'm not there to tell people not to use cannabis. Yeah.
I'll just say it's unlikely to improve your memory or your cognitive function, especially over time. I think there's enough evidence out there.
Yeah. We did find a really cool effect that, it's super complex. And so no one's ever going to cite it. But it was this effect on encoding where we essentially showed, so in a previous study, we showed that, so there's the idea that if you study something, you should take your test in that same place, context-dependent learning. If I study in this room, I'll perform better if I take my test in this room. And so we decided to see if there's ever a case where that could be bad. So if I saw, a dog at the beach, and then later on I go back to that beach and I see a similar dog, I'm probably going to think it's the same dog.
Yeah.
Or will I be able to, because I'm reinstating the context, have a more accurate, memory and be like, wait a minute, no, I remember the original dog because I'm back at the beach and I can reject that this is not the actual dog. Turns out that one didn't work. That's what I thought was going to happen, that if you reinstate the context, you'll have a veridical representation of the original memory and then you can reject this new thing that's sort of similar to what you previously saw. So it turns out if you give cannabis during memory encoding, so THC specifically, you can amplify that effect, but you can also remove that false memory effect too, depending on the semantic congruency between the context and then that item. So dog at the beach, semantically congruent, it's going to amplify that effect, that false memory effect. You're going to be more likely to think, it must be the same dog. Cat at the beach. Cats don't usually hang out at beaches. That's actually going to abolish that false memory effect. So in that sense, you can say, well, in that very specific condition, THC during memory encoding actually gave you a more accurate memory.
You mentioned something earlier that's really worth exploring. You talked about the guy with the thumbtack. Mm-hmm. And he didn't want to shake hands the second time, but he didn't know why, so he made up a story.
Mm-hmm.
And what I've learned over time is that I, like all humans, am a master of believing my own bullshit. Right? Because my body, my hardware will automatically make up a story to match whatever I'm feeling. Right? And a lot of meditation, a lot of personal development work is just learning that is the case and that you should be curious about whether it's real or not. Talk to me about memory fallibility and what we can do about that.
Yeah. So, I think that I don't always know how much we can do. I think that there's a lot of these processes that are sort of automatic sometimes. We're kind of associative machines that, automatically try to extract regularities. And sometimes it's actually adaptive to have these processes. So a lot of times in the lab, we study, false memory and, we can try to make cases in which this could be bad. But for example, if I give you the words bed, rest, and awake, and later on you remember the word sleep, that's probably adaptive. You're compressing all this bed, rest, awake information into one word. Like, what's the general concept that we talked about? Sleep. And, it's probably more adaptive than not. So I think that just, the one thing I'll say is that, you shouldn't always trust your memory, that you should be willing to admit that you have a fallible system. I think the Mandela effect is a great example of self-preservation where people can't admit that their memories suck sometimes and they remember, the Monopoly guy with the monocle and they want to say, people in the future are controlling us instead of taking blame for their own shitty memories. So I think knowing, I think exactly what you said is,
Are you a monocle guy or a non-monocle guy?
I think, now I know that effect, so I don't know what I would have said not too long ago, but a friend and I were talking about this, and I think it was with the Pikachu. We did think that it had a black tip on the end of its tail, and I don't think Pikachu does.
Wow, so either the guys at CERN split reality or our memories suck.
Yeah, I think, the more, plausible case is that the guys at CERN are controlling us. Yeah, no.
Most definitely. Yeah.
Yeah. So, I think there's a lot of kind of cognitive illusions. And, this is something that, I've become kind of interested with things like psychedelics, that, what becomes very fluently processed can feel very real. And so this is known as the illusory truth effect. So, for example, if I show you a statement multiple times over, you're going to be more likely to believe it. So, a lot of politicians probably do this, right? They repeat something over, or advertising even, right? Advertising, they show it to you multiple times over. Finally, you're like, you know what? Maybe I should get into that clinical trial or use that medication or whatever. I think politicians do this too, and sometimes some of us are less susceptible, we don't believe that guy, but the people who are already leaning towards believing that person, after they say something so many times over, they might say, oh, you know what? That is true, even though no new data are coming in. So, yeah, I think that there's a lot of different types of cognitive illusions. Like, we all know like visual perceptual illusions, right? But I think even like at the kind of higher level cognition, that can happen, that, we should, just know that, you're not perfect. Yeah.
I've seen some research that says memory retrieval is indexed or organized by emotions and physical senses. Is that accurate?
I think it can be, but I think again, it depends probably on what type of memory you're talking about. I think that people, again, I don't want to say the amygdala is the only thing that supports emotion. And in fact, some people will say that, you still have emotion, and a lot of that's actually interpreted through the cortex. But for example, people can not have an amygdala and they can still, form memories. They can still retrieve memories of different types, whether it's semantic memory or episodic memory. Even conditioning can be done without, like fear conditioning, I think can be done without an amygdala, although it depends on how you do it. But yeah, I think emotion is definitely, a huge part. That's like episodic memory. Some people say, yeah, like episodic memory without emotion is not really all that episodic. Like it all has somewhat of an emotional component to it. But yeah.
I've found that by removing emotional triggers, that it enhances my ability to remember real things versus my story around things.
Yeah, I think that the story around things, while it can distort your memory at times, it can also be useful for kind of creating retrieval cues so that one thing chains off of the next. Again, it's like evolution wasn't perfect, right? And it helps us for certain ways, and it also creates a bunch of garbage in other ways.
Yeah.
So, I think it depends on, what you're trying to remember. If you think about, the memory palace or the method of loci, right? That's like, using this kind of story, this context to remember a bunch of useless things that are very temporary. Like if you ask any of those, like, those memorists, if you ask any of them like a day later, like, oh, hey, what was that deck of cards? They're not going to remember it. It kind of shows you just how quick episodic memories can be forgotten. But yeah, if you're trying to get something into semantic memory, I don't always know, it's like, yeah, try to relate it to a schema that you already have. Repetition, of course, spaced repetition specifically. But yeah.
It's fascinating. I'm remembering I was studying some of the early alchemists, and these are the people who eventually started the Enlightenment and a lot of what became the scientific method. And they're also studying longevity and immortality, which was the thing behind their quest for the Philosopher's Stone and all kinds of esoteric knowledge. And one of the stories I came across was from one of the famous figures, I don't remember which one. And as a child, he was with his father, and they threw a log on the fire, and a salamander jumped out of the log. Now, they believe that the fire turned into salamanders. They called them fire lizards, and it's actually a symbol of alchemy. Back when I was running Bulletproof, you might have noticed there was a salamander hidden on the packaging for the first few years. That was a little Easter egg for people. And if you notice the logo for Upgrade Labs, it's an axolotl, which is a form of salamander that also has Wolverine's regenerative abilities, where you can smash its entire spinal column. It just grows back. It doesn't die. They're crazy, like very powerful, strange little animals. Anyway, I digress. So when the salamander jumped out of the log, the guy's father smacked him in the ear. And he started crying. He says, why'd you do that? He said, because that was unusual and I want you to remember it.
Oh. Yeah, so it's interesting. Doing something like that it can produce certain memorable events. Creating those types of event boundaries, though, can also, there also might be other things that are forgotten. Like maybe write what happened at that moment. Sure, what happened in the 5 minutes before that might now be more likely to be forgotten later. So, yeah, it's interesting. As I said, there's always kind of sacrifices to, enhancing certain things. I mentioned, like I said, with psychedelics, it's like, well, it might help get things into the cortex, but you're sacrificing what's going on in the hippocampus, or perhaps even the case with something like neuroadrenergic, increases. Well, I mean, there's a really cool thing, like that's what people think underlies the whole weapon focus effect, is that, you remember really well what's going on in the center of your vision, but everything at the periphery gets sacrificed.
I believe that having a calm nervous system improves your ability to remember actual reality versus flavored reality. And so training that, whether it's through heart rate variability or meditation or breathing or anything like that, does at a minimum reduce the amount of electrical noise in the system so those electrons can go to good use. Have you seen anything about advanced meditators having better memory, or people who've done their trauma work being able to remember things better?
So no, not necessarily. Although there's something that you brought up, the idea of trauma and remembering. And in this case, are you talking about remembering the trauma itself better, or just in general after the trauma?
Usually people have patterns or triggers from trauma. They have less emotional calmness because it keeps getting triggered unconsciously. When they remove the trigger so that they have more, we'll call it more peace, their ability to remember both the trauma and anything else new increases because they're wasting less electricity on old defense mechanisms.
Yeah, so definitely, I mean, somebody with, for example, PTSD, it's this very kind of, paradoxical disorder where they have this very vivid recollection of, their trauma or multiple traumas, and yet their everyday memory actually does become kind of poor. There's a really interesting, like alcohol, cortisol, for example. Not to say this is strictly dependent on cortisol, but cortisol during encoding can impair your memory. Again, there's certain nuances there to what I just said, but if you, for example, stress people out immediately after, showing them a bunch of stimuli, you can enhance their memory. In fact, actually, Charin's colleague, Andy Onalinas, he had people study, I can't remember, I think it was pictures, a handful of pictures while they're going up in a plane, and then he threw them out of the airplane. And then their memory was better for those pictures, and they got thrown out of the airplane. So, there is, but yeah, so I just digressed a little bit myself, but I think, so yeah, I think that there's something to be said about that. But then, there's also, being calm. I think you're right that overall that's going to be better than remembering certain things anyways. But I do wonder, for example, like if you're really calm while somebody's really angry, you might not forget some of the things that they said to you, which is probably a good thing. You probably don't need to hear all the terrible, angry things they said. But what if you, kind of forget just how angry they were, and it probably might be useful to remember how angry they were, to be like, oh, this is an angry person while you're really chill. This person might be dangerous, I don't know. It might be useful sometimes to get that, kind of kicked in. But, the idea of remembering trauma, I take a little issue with that. Because so essentially the idea of, repressing memories, and we're not talking about like avoidance, but we're talking about like straight up not remembering,
that's a problem when people can't remember. They're really traumatized, right?
Well, if they truly can't, they're unlikely to ever be able to. It's the idea of recovering memories is so unfounded by the memory world, and the idea of creating false memories is a lot more founded. And so it's, I mean, and I know that that's, I feel, and I don't want to like negate anybody's experiences, but like, just to give you an example, for example, the guy that didn't have a hippocampus, he definitely got a little messed up from getting the tack in his hand, but he doesn't have any kind of like recollection of it, right? And he'll never be able to access that because it was never formed in the first place if his hippocampus was damaged. But or even like as a 2-year-old, if, there was some type of abuse in your life as a 2-year-old, it'll almost certainly, at least for a lot of people, mess them up. Later on in life, they might be more like, hyper aroused. They might be more, vigilant, or anxious or whatever. But they're not going to ever be able to access those memories. Why
not? I mean, regression therapy is a thing.
Freud is very unfounded. So it's actually really unfortunate right now in the psychedelic world. There've been some inklings of, kind of the Freudians are coming back out from the 60s.
Yeah, I'm not talking about Freudian stuff. This is more transpersonal Stan Groffland.
Yeah, it's still, I'm not, yeah.
You're skeptical on that one.
And I know when I say me, I think there's a lot of people out there. Essentially that kind of, so the issue with something like PTSD is not that you can't remember your trauma, it's that you can't forget it. And so I think, what did happen, if you look at, for example, the Satanic Panic, that is a great example of manipulating the memories of vulnerable people such that they're, claiming that they had all these terrible things happen. For example, that all these babies were being sacrificed. There's only so many babies you can sacrifice before somebody, finds out. There's, somebody has to carry that baby for 9 months. Like, if the baby just suddenly disappears, people are going to start asking questions. They never found any babies that were sacrificed in satanic rituals during the Satanic Panic, but they were people who were being manipulated by, psychoanalytic type people saying that, oh, you've got something that you need to remember. And there ended up being, some really bizarre cases of, and I do think that, don't get me wrong, childhood abuse happens, but I mean, just look at the Me Too movement right now. There's never been a case in the Me Too movement where somebody said, oh, I forgot it and now remembering. What they said was that, oh, I didn't come out because I didn't want, I didn't think anybody was going to believe me, or, I thought that people were going to like blackball me or something, It's never been the case that somebody forgot their trauma and then, decided to come out. Yeah. After they've remembered it. Yeah.
I know people who have forgotten childhood traumas. This is around 7, 8-year-old kind of things. And then doing breath work or psychedelics or even neurofeedback, or especially MDMA is really good for that. They go, oh my God, I remember it. And then they talk to the person. And like, yeah, that did happen. How did you remember?
Yeah. So, I mean, I don't want to say it's impossible, but I think that the data are pretty slim. And, what I mentioned about THC causing false memories is something that we've sort of saw actually with MDMA as well. I would love to redo that study and, get better statistical power. But I mean, look at the supplement, look at our newest review on that. We definitely show evidence towards memory distortions.
Memory distortions and false memories are real. In my experience, sometimes people do remember real things that are verifiable later. And that's when it starts to get really interesting, where you're going, oh, like maybe it's both. And sorting that out is really difficult.
Yeah, and I think that there's two things there. Like, one is also, again, to kind of bring this, to like Me Too, some people just also didn't want to talk about it. It's not just that, they were afraid of getting blackballed or that they didn't think anyone was going to believe them. It's just nobody wants to have to go through that again, know? So there's that kind of element to it. There's also, I think, the not being able to interpret things. So, for example, if, before you knew what sex was, if somebody had you, perform some sexual act, you wouldn't necessarily know how to interpret that, right? And it might still cause some harm to you later. It
causes all kinds of destabilization.
Yeah. And so later on, you might then put the two together and be like, oh, shit, like that person abused me, right? Or I think that there's sometimes other types of ways you can link information. So I had a friend she's a clinical psychologist. And, I was asking her about, like, oh, have you had any type of situation, either recovered memory, false memory, whatever.
Right.
She was like, no, but she was like, the closest I can think of is there was somebody who went, through therapy, kind of linked these two ideas together, that they knew both of these ideas separately, but never put them together. Essentially what it was that this person, it was verified, this person was abused, the person's uncle was whatever in prison, got, they knew that had happened. She also, this the victim also knew that she had, that her parents used to go out of town. Through therapy, she linked those two together on weekends. It was like, oh my God, this was able to happen because my parents used to go out of town on weekends. And, it's like one of those connections that it seems very simple, like, okay, but to her, it was the world, and she never linked that together, and that like helped her kind of get through her problems, helped her narrative, etc. So I think there's those types of things that can happen, linking two ideas together in kind of a novel fashion. But, I think I would I'm very cautious, and I think I've heard people talk about this too with psychedelic therapy in some of the clinical trials, where people will, come up with what might not necessarily be a vertical representation of reality. Like maybe their parents hit them, but then it goes kind of even deeper. And especially when you have things like satanic rituals and sacrificing, that's when it's like, okay, that's probably not real, right?
Yeah. There are some, this is a thing where let's say that half of those memories are fake and half of them are real, or maybe it's 80-20. It's hard to throw the baby out with the bathwater if you can verify them.
Right.
And it's the times you can verify, say, oh, no, this person was here and they did this and they confessed to this, or they did it to the neighbor too. Then you're going, okay, there's something going on there. And I don't think anyone knows how to tell what's a false memory versus what's a real memory other than other witnesses. Right?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think sometimes it, in many cases, it might not even matter, right? Like sometimes it's just like, oh, hey, it could be like, actually, my mother and I didn't have a great relationship. And, coming to that conclusion, I mean, that might even strengthen your relationship with your parents later, right?
Sure.
It's when it goes into like deeper details, where that's when it can be a little bit, more dangerous. But I agree that it's, if something like that happened to me, it would be, I'm sure I would be that person, be like, oh, yeah, it's definitely real when I recovered it,
We all are, yeah.
And I think, again, what's something that I think psychedelics can do especially is they kind of enhance the sense of knowing. It feels like just undeniably true. And so even if they're provided with evidence that goes against what they're saying, I think it can be very difficult to kind of shake these things. And even in the case of, without psychedelics, what's his name? So Remembering Satan is the name of the book. Lawrence Graham?
I don't remember.
Yeah. And so he's the author of Remembering Satan. I think he actually lives here in Austin. But yeah, like in that book. So I think by the end of it, they were like, okay, clearly this wasn't a case of sexual abuse. And I think that the family is still completely broken apart. And, I think the daughters have, changed their identities, but still think that something happened. And it was a pretty crazy situation. Like the father started admitting to these things, and including there was a situation where this professor from Berkeley at the time came to him and, while he's in jail and said, oh, hey, your daughter told me you made her commit incest. And he said, oh, I don't remember. And he's like, go back to your cell and start praying on it. Because that's what he would do, is he would pray and then he would get these visions. And he was like, oh my God, I did abuse my daughter. So in this situation, he didn't the daughters never said that. They never said anything about incest. He goes back to his cell next day, talks to him and says, oh my God, I can remember it now. And gives you this extremely graphic, the only thing I can think of is where this guy got this graphic story from, is misattributing his own experience with pornography onto what was happening here.
Wow,
it was absolutely nuts. Yeah, this guy spent I don't even know how many years in prison, but I don't know, a decade or something, a while he spent for something that almost certainly he didn't do. And he was so easily suggestible, that this professor from Berkeley who barely even knew him was able to plant a false memory in his head like that.
Okay.
Yeah.
How do we make ourselves less suggestible?
I don't know, actually. I think
I made you say that.
and sometimes, it as you said, I think being skeptical can sometimes hurt, right?
Yeah.
Not believing, there's any magic left in the world. I mean, that kind of sucks, I, certainly have, had to fight with that, right? It was kind of I don't know if you grew up religious at all, but you have a little bit of that, and then you're kind of maybe this isn't the case, but maybe there's still something else. And then it's kind of especially in science, it's just all that kind of gets stripped away, and it's ooh, all the magic in the world is gone.
No, you bring Joe Dispenza to speak at your event. Man, there's some serious science going on there. 3,000 people, genetic analysis, cytokine analysis, and it seems like there's still some magic left in the world. And I actually grew up as atheist and agnostic and didn't believe any of this, PhD engineering grandparents, even my grandmother. So very, very skeptical family. And I'm to the point where, world's both magical and not magical simultaneously. It just depends which lens you want to use.
Yeah. I mean, I think that my thing is, studying the brain and just the fact that you can create anything, right? You can, in theory, with whatever amount of probably brainwashing and drugs, you torture somebody, you can get them to have whatever crazy experiences and memories and whatever, that it's anybody can be driven psychotic, It's a pretty, yeah.
Are you familiar with Daniel Brown from Harvard, his research on hypnotism?
I know of him, but I don't know specifically his work. Yeah.
He came on the show, and it was one of the most profound episodes ever, because this is one of the world's leading experts in hypnosis. And he says, there's such a thing as a Manchurian candidate. And he stops and he said, I spent 100 hours with Sirhan Sirhan, And I will tell you, as a leading expert in hypnosis, he was hypnotized. We know who did it, where they did it. When I would tap him on the arm twice, he would drop into a crouch and talk about kill points. Like if anything in my entire career, anyone has been programmed with hypnosis, it was him. And I said, oh my God, they should do a documentary on this. And he looks at me and he goes, they did. And then they deleted my 8 minutes in the documentary and audited my taxes for 7 years.
Oh, wow.
And he was saying this because he has a neurodegenerative condition and was like, my career is amazing. And this is a very, very credible and knowledgeable guy who in his spare time translates 13th century Sanskrit cave meditation manuscripts so they aren't lost to the world. I mean, this is just someone who has no agenda. Mm-hmm. And I'm like, did this just happen on the show? So we know that sometimes people are programmed that way. And I'm interested in making a world where advertisers and politicians in particular cannot program people.
Yeah, but I think they bootstrap off of things that are good. So as I mentioned, the illusory truth effect. There's also what's known as the mere exposure effect. Same idea, except, I present a stimulus to you multiple times, you're more likely to like it. Yeah. It essentially goes off of this familiarity, this cortical processing. The ease of processing or fluency tends to be associated with things that we like more. You could think of it takes less resources, so we like it more. Perhaps that's, one story behind it. And so, that can be a good thing, as much as it sucks that, oh yeah, now it means I'm going to drink, Coca-Cola over Pepsi. It also, can mean, hey, that person that, I felt a little uncomfortable around, the second time I see them, I feel a little bit warmer and it's more easy to talk to them, I'm less one of these people. I can usually talk to anybody, but, some people, they're not as easily able to and it just takes multiple times over. That my partner's actually like this, where she's not always warm initially, but then, after a few times, even if it's the most mundane conversations, it's like, all right, now she's warmer to, to people. So I think that it's hard to completely remove those things. And yeah, unfortunately, I think, I think we just have to be more aware of them, but, yeah.
There's all sorts of different ways that we can be manipulated. And I think just being more aware, more conscious, having more energy and having less chaos in your system makes it easier to notice. But even then, we all have our vulnerabilities, and that's what happens when you ride around in a human body.
Yeah, I do wonder, with, I wonder if I'd be hypnotizable, for example. I mentioned, I was like, oh yeah, if you give me enough torture or, drugs or whatever, sure, but I would be very curious. I know that one time I got scammed by somebody selling clothes on the street when I was 22 or 3, and I'm the most skeptical person that, as I've mentioned, and yet it did happen to me once, and I felt I was like, oh my God, got a little bit of schizophrenia in my family, and I was like, oh my God, is this about to start?
Right? And so I guess constant vigilance is the most important thing you do is this person running an operation on me? And I've done an episode with Robert Cialdini, who wrote the book Influence out of the University of Arizona. And he went undercover with insurance salesmen and used car salesmen to learn the techniques of manipulation and then come up with a manual. I actually bought his book for my kids and told them I'd give them $50 if they read it. Because he's like, here's how to tell when someone's running a playbook to manipulate you outside your conscious awareness. I was like, wow, that's like a firewall for your brain. So there's some techniques. But I want to ask you about 2 drugs in particular. Mm-hmm. We haven't talked about that affect memory. Oh.
Is that nicotine?
1 milligram of nicotine. You want some?
Sure.
Don't breathe in while you do it. It's minty. There you go.
Interesting.
So what does nicotine do for our brains?
So, yeah, it's a nicotinic agonist, as you probably know. So that works on the cholinergic system. The cholinergic system is very much involved in episodic memory, hippocampal dependent memory. So people have, for example, scopolamine. That's a drug that massively knocks out your episodic memory. It also, there was a study that found if you administer scopolamine after encoding, unlike alcohol, it didn't enhance your memory. But if you administer it along with the nicotinergic antagonist, then you got the retrograde facilitation.
Translate that to less science.
Yeah, sorry. So if you administer an antagonist of both types of cholinergic receptors, so you have nicotinic, and then you also have muscarinic,
okay.
muscarinic. And so if you block both types of receptors, now you can retroactively enhance your memory.
Wow.
And so, study something, block both those receptors, it can enhance. But just like alcohol, benzos, it's kind of like that effect. So there's a really boring reason for some of these things, whether it's alcohol or whether it's because of this, because of its, a cholinergic antagonist. It's that if you prevent new learning from happening, the old stuff can stabilize better without interference. That's the really boring answer. It turns out, at least with the GABA positive allosteric modulators, there might be something more complicated going on there. But as I mentioned though, so if you block these receptors, it impairs memory. But a lot of times when you activate them, it can actually enhance memory. So people have shown, for example, with nicotine, that if you administer it to people who don't even smoke, there's one study in particular I can think of where I think it was done with a patch. And even people who don't smoke, it enhanced memory encoding. And so it certainly has some, effects. Like I said, it drives that cholinergic system, which is highly involved in encoding, consolidation, and retrieval. So I think that there's something there. I don't want to say, people should always use nicotine. I think it can become certainly, obviously it's quite addictive. And a lot of times what, people will say is that, right, it kind of just, your baseline kind of goes down a little bit and then it brings you back up. I still think that it's possible that it can still pull you above your baseline.
There's pretty good studies of nicotine as a cognitive enhancer. And my recommendation is between 1 and 5 milligrams. There's 20 milligrams in a cigarette. So this is 1 to 5 over the course of a day. And you really don't want to do more than that for longevity. I call him Dr. Nicotine, Andrew Newhouse from Vanderbilt, who's been studying since 1986, publishing papers that say small doses of pharmaceutical nicotine, smoking is bad for you, tobacco is bad for you, don't do that. He says when you do the pharmaceutical extract, it reverses or inhibits Alzheimer's disease. And we know smokers don't get Parkinson's and Alzheimer's, they get cancer instead. But if you're using pure nicotine at very low doses, it definitely acts as a cognitive enhancer. And if you keep your dose constant, it works every day.
Yeah. So actually one of the things that they'll give to people with Alzheimer's, for example, are cholinesterase inhibitors. So essentially they block the enzyme that would break down acetylcholine, the kind of, you can sort of think of it as your like endogenous nicotine, you know? So it's a slightly different mechanism, but it still involves the same system. Yeah, and there have been, exactly, if not nicotininergic agonist studies, drugs that bind to the nicotine receptor that probably have similar effects as nicotine.
Okay.
And I mean, I think the issue is, they can be quite addictive. And so, but yeah, I think you're right to, I think nicotine, it certainly has some cardiovascular effects that maybe aren't always good, just like, caffeine. But, at least with something like caffeine, we've all accepted those cardiovascular effects and, we all drink it every day, many of us anyways.
I think it comes down to microdosing it versus smoking. And they're just so mixed up. People think coffee and caffeine are the same. They're not. They think tobacco and nicotine are the same, and they're not. And it's very dose dependent. So there's something there. But my favorite drug of all time, one I really popularized at the start of the biohacking movement, I went on ABC Nightline for the first time. And they're like, this guy is taking the limitless pill. And he used it to get through Wharton Business School. And he's using it as an entrepreneur. And is it fair to use such a big cognitive enhancer? Of course, that was modafinil. What's your take on modafinil?
Yeah, so modafinil is used. So because I study drugs, people are sometimes more open to talking about their drug use, but it's used a lot more in academia than I think some people realize.
Oh my God, yeah.
And so especially at conferences, like there are people I know who have prescriptions to it. They take it every day. And sometimes they'll even take like low doses. So, 200 milligrams of modafinil is, I think what a lot of times is prescribed.
100's where it starts and 200 is the big pill.
They'll take 50,
Yeah, I'll do 50. In fact, that's a normal dose for me.
Yeah. And so, but yeah, what I've seen sometimes at conferences is one reason I think people take it is you're staying out late, networking, drinking. But I will say that some of those networking events that involve alcohol have produced some papers in my life. But then, you're waking up early for that conference the next day. I don't know why conferences don't start at like 11 o'clock. But yeah, so people will take modafinil. And so I have seen that. I think that, it's as far as like getting work done for some people, it's certainly works. I knew, no names here. I know a professor who does take it, and he even said, he's like, yeah, I take it every day. He's like, forget it, even if I'm not working, it's fun,
I've noticed the same effect. It improves my meditation. It improves just a lot of different aspects. And for me, I went off of it for a while just to see what happened. And bottom line is, I like my life better on that cognitive enhancer.
I feel that way about caffeine.
Yeah. And I've gone off caffeine for 5 years before I figured out mold in coffee was tweaking on me. So I would drink coffee and get all jittery. And so I invented mold-free coffee. There you go. But those are the two things that would be like the most important in cognitive enhancers. For me, it would be coffee and modafinil, and followed very quickly thereafter by nicotine and then aniracetam. If you could name 4 in a row, your most important cognitive enhancers, what would they be?
I mean, unfortunately, I think amphetamine is still probably a pretty good one. Adderall, right?
It comes at a cost, but yeah.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
I hate this stuff.
And I mean, I think, definitely, people will feel tweaky on it, especially, closer to the end, or if they take another dose.
Yeah. Adderall, number 2.
Okay. So Adderall, I think caffeine, honestly, is probably number 1 for just because it's the safest and like... there are people who get kind of addicted. They take like 500 milligrams a day, and that's not good for you, I don't think. Yeah, the FDA has some limit of 300 or 400 milligrams.
Does anyone still believe them?
Yeah, sometimes. I mean, I think it depends,
That means they don't believe them. They're skeptical.
I'll
go with the longevity researchers who say up to 5 cups a day extends your lifespan. At least it reduces your all-cause mortality and reduces some things. That's around 400 milligrams.
So there were people at Hopkins studying this, and I'm forgetting now what their limit was, but they were saying that there were some cardiovascular, problems.
At the upper limits, yeah.
Yeah, around 400, 500 milligrams, I think.
So yeah, let's do rapid fire. So
okay, so
you got Adderall, you got caffeine.
I mean, honestly, forget Adderall. I think methylphenidate is probably better, given that I think it's a little less addictive.
Methylphenidate, caffeine.
I guess modafinil seems to work for a lot of people.
Yeah, one more.
What's the 4th? I don't know. I mean, the thing is, I don't necessarily take all these things, so it's hard for me to say. But I don't know. Exercise, yeah, fuck, that should be number. I mean, it gets certain things going in your system.
Would you put nicotine on there?
Oh, yeah, nicotine. Yeah, nicotine is, one.
It raises PGC1 alpha the same as exercise anyway. So
yeah.
Some of those effects.
But again, I think with all of these things, I'm not endorsing them because, especially given the addictive properties, UT would have my head if I were endorsing any of these
You're not
things.
endorsing. I mean, just looking at just a scientific question on it.
Well, I mean, retrograde facilitation with alcohol is a very robust effect that's been replicated by numerous groups around the world.
Really bad for you. So.
Right, drinking alcohol. Yeah, I mean, but again, it depends on how much you're doing it. I think that, again, this has not been tested in a lab, but let's pretend it actually does work it hasn't been tested in a lab. It hasn't been tested in like people taking tests. Mm-hmm. Let's pretend alcohol retroactively can enhance what you studied the hour before, and you did this, let's say, once a month. How bad would that be for you? People drink so much more than that.
That's fair. Yeah. Awesome. Manoj, this has been a fascinating conversation, and you're plumbing these depths of the brain that a lot of people don't think about. And there's a spiritual side to this. There's a hard science side, and understanding what's a memory, what's not a memory, how to make it better. I think it's one of the frontiers of human consciousness, understanding how to drive our bodies better. And it's a major part of the biohacking movement. So thanks for the work you're doing, and thanks for making the drive over to be live in the Human Upgrade studio.
Oh, yeah. No, thanks for having me here. And happy to talk anytime.
Guys, if you liked today's episode, you know what to do. Drink some coffee, have a spray of nicotine, take a modafinil. That's what Manoj recommended.
I did not say that.
Just kidding. You know what to do. Hit subscribe, like, follow, all that kind of stuff. And if you like the episode, share it with someone who needs to remember.